أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to session number 17 of our Eschatology podcast. And inshallah, what I want to do in this episode, as well as the next three, which will then conclude what we might term as season 1 of our Eschatology podcast, what I want to talk about is the concept of ideologies or ideologies and philosophies, and how they take part insofar as the finality of humankind is concerned. We spoke about in one of the earlier sessions that eschatology has got two primary parts. One pertains the final hour and the other pertains the origin. So you've got Ilmul Akhir Zaman, which now looks at the events that are transpiring towards the finality up until the final hour. And then you also have Ilmul Awwal Zaman, which looks at now the origin of the species, the human being. It's like the first chapter in this epic of humankind, and then the final chapter, which is the final hour, demonstrates the climax of this epic. So in order to understand what is transpiring towards the end, it is important to know the premises that sets forth the entire epic. What transpired in the beginning that now culminates towards a finality. The world of the human being, whether it's political or whatever other aspect of its civilization, is all shaped by philosophies and ideologies, thought forms that are enacted in this realm of ours. Because we say that language defines thought, thought defines a worldview, worldview is projected into reality, and then civilization is a product of that worldview being cultivated. If you look at civilization, it originates from culture, and culture is that which is cultivated. So the ideology plays a fundamental role in this entire process. The language input is either a language that is divinely inspired or a language that is demonically inspired. So it's either one of these two. Either it comes from a source of good or it comes from a source of evil. And the language that comes from a source of good enables the individual to formulate sound thought, which then projects a worldview that is in harmony with the divine ordinance. And likewise, a language that comes from a source of evil projects a worldview that is evil-oriented. And then that's how reality is then cultivated. So an ideology is essentially a system of ideas and ideals. Ideas are what are formulated based on information that is received, which is not the language input, whether it is done through sensory acquisition or of just looking at the environment, looking at the realm, looking at the surroundings, and then drawing out that information to say, okay, I think this concludes with this and this combines with that. Or it comes from preconceived or preset notions, ideas that are already existent prior to that, which would either come from a source of good or evil. For the human being, psychologically, there are 4 primary sources of thought. There are thoughts that are Rabbaniya, there are thoughts that are Shaitaniya, thoughts that are Malaikiya, and then thoughts that are Nafsaniya. So there are thoughts that come directly from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that are pure in nature. And there are thoughts that come from angelic suggestions. For example, you are doing your fard salah, and then you do your sunnah, and then you get this thought to perform the nafila. That would be considered like an angelic suggestion. Then there are thoughts that come from the demons. The demonic thoughts are always geared towards disobedience, of turning away from divine ordinance, of doing contrary to what has been ordained, doing contrary to what the fitrah of the human being is inclined towards doing, which is an inclination of good. And then there are thoughts that are nafsaniya, that are generated from the self, and this is due to the internal configuration of the human psyche, where you've got these 3 main faculties, that is the intellect, that is the concupiscence, and then the irascibility. You've got your rational faculty, you have got your appetites, and then you've got your emotional or emotive faculty. These can be in an inflated state or a depleted state. An inflated intellect is an overworking intellect that puts its entire trust on what it deduces and establishes that as the truth. Inflated appetites are those that then result in greed and lust and overconsumption. Inflated emotions are what result in things like anger and wrath, destruction. And then depleted are the opposite of those. And so these are thoughts that originate from a nafsaniya perspective. So all these are ideas that are formulated using one or more of the configurations of all these influences. And the ideal in this case is that which is understood as the best idea. Because you're coming up with ideas and you're going to get some ideas that are just faulty, that are just useless. But then you've got ideas that actually come up and have some validity, they have proof, and they have some benefit to them. These are the ideals. So an ideology is a combination of the ideas themselves and those ideas that are ideal. But all the ideologies from which you now get all the philosophies, all the isms, if you will, right? You get your capitalism and communism and socialism, all these isms. These are all ideologies that have taken form and have gained some establishment or manifestation in reality. All of these can be traced back to a prime origin. Whether it's a good idea or a bad idea, a good ideology, bad ideology, good philosophy, bad philosophy, they will all be traced to a prime origin. They've got a source point in human history to which they can be traced. And the only logical tracing that we can establish from that is to say that if ideologies arise from the human being, then all ideologies can be traced back to the prime human being as a universal comprehensive ideology. This is what you would call like an evolution of an ideology, because ideas evolve. As reality changes, ideas themselves evolve, and then they change and they take on different forms. Now, it's not an easy thing to definitively establish how one ideology stems from another one, and then where did that one come from, and then how does that connect to this other one, to be able to go back in a sort of a chain to that prime origin. It's not possible because ideas themselves are not physical constructs with physically measurable dimensions. They are not definitive in the sense that you can actually put, some sort of a connection and establish a cause to an effect to say this idea stems from this other idea. You see, ideas are fluid in nature. They are always changing. They're always morphing. So you can have an idea and then undergo the process of formulating that idea such that by the time the formulation is complete, there is a vast contrast between the final and the initial. That same idea in its final sense cannot be fully articulated. You cannot bring out the entire idea definitively. What is being articulated is also different from what is internally realized of it. In the same sense that when you're trying to tell somebody something and you're trying to explain it to them and they say, oh, this is what you mean, and you say, no, that's not what I mean. What I'm trying to say, what I had as an idea, that's not what it is. That's not what I initially thought of it as to be. You see, it's different. And the interpretation that the other person draws from that idea is also different. And so it's very difficult to trace back ideas. All we can look for is how one idea might have influenced another idea. And this is where sometimes you find scholars who, you will look at which other scholar preceding them and their ideas, what they influenced by, especially with philosophers. You'd look at such and such a philosopher and see, oh, he was influenced by this philosopher and that philosopher. And so his philosophy follows that sort of way of thinking or that school of thought. It becomes a lot more complicated, rather too complicated to unravel, especially when we do not even have complete historical records of a chain of transmission. See, all modern philosophies can somehow be traced back to the Greeks, right? You have either Socrates, Plato, Greek, and you've got a number of other philosophers also. But then it's difficult to now trace back further than that. Where did their ideas come from? Who were they influenced by? And then who are those guys influenced by? It's just too complicated to unravel because there's a lot of missing data in this picture. So for this reason now, when we look at the Quran, we find something incredible, that the Quran actually provides us with the prime source itself. The origin of all ideological understanding can be traced back to basically two distinct modes of understanding, or schools of thought, if you will. One school of thought, one mode of understanding, pertains complete submission to divine will. And then the other is its antonymic form, which is complete opposition to divine will. And that's essentially it. All ideologies can basically be categorized to fall either in one group or the other group, whether in whole or in part. And an ideology is accepted if it falls in the first group, being submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and is completely rejected if it falls in the other group. I mean, it's easy as that now, because once you have the prime category, you know where you're going to place each one. And if an ideology adheres to the first group in part, then only those parts that are in adherence would be taken, and then the rest would be discarded. They would be thrown aside as having now fallen onto the other category. This is now what we want to look at. We want to look at this prime origin. What transpired insofar as the events that began this epic of human being, what transpired in the very beginning that set in motion two distinct schools of thought, such that when you look at the Quran in its holistic sense, you've got a categorization of distinct groups of people who are either on this side or on that side. You see, they're either mu'min or they are kafir. They are either submitters to Allah or they are rejectors of Allah. You see, they are either on the right path or they have gone astray. These two distinct groups of people that are being categorized. And then from these two is when you see now the subcategories of these different groups, of these two groups. Because when we look at the materialization of what is taking place in the world at present, in the present continuum, the most dominating ideology out there is the idea of secularization, the idea of secularism. And at its core, it is a simple enough ideology to understand. It is the act of removing divine will from man's governance. And it's as simple as that. Secularization is the removal of divine will from the governance of man. And they'll give it a different kind of a definition to sort of pass it off, you know. They'll give definitions like removal of religion from state affairs, which is a very reduced kind of a definition. So it doesn't really have that much of an effect. And then they will justify it accordingly and say, you see, we are a country with many religions and we don't know which religion, whom should we give preference to. It is just better that we do not give any one religion any preference insofar as state affairs are concerned. It is better we just create a law that would be fair to all of them. And so this is what they will call secular. But that's at a very subsistent level. It's at a rudimentary level. Because secular, the idea of secular, and Muslims also need to understand this. It's not all that bad, to be fair. It's not all that bad. The idea that, you do not need religion to govern all these worldly activities. Like, where do you build a road? You don't need religion to tell you that. Who do you appoint as your representative in council? You don't need religion to tell you that. How do you build a civil structure for services rendered to the public? You don't need religion to tell you that. You don't need religion to tell you where the electricity poles should be, or how the water networking should be done, or how, all these things. You don't need the municipality. You don't need religion to tell you that. This is something that you can figure out by yourself and find the most efficient system that functions for everyone and functions for everyone in a fair and just manner. You see, so that's this rudimentary definition of it. Now, you need religion when it comes into hierarchies, the upper levels. What they are trying to do is to remove religion even at those levels. You see, removing religion at all hierarchy levels, not just on the street level. The act of doing that is what you call secularization. So you've got the term secular, which is the object or the subject in this case. Then you've got the act of turning a thing secular, and this is secularization. And then you've got secularism, that is the ideology that is constantly evolving and changing and taking shape, adding more and more elements that then determine the process of secularization. This is what we want to ultimately arrive at, to look now at the very source of it. What is secularism? Where does it originate from? Where does it come from? Because it's not something that some German philosopher sat down somewhere and thought and said, I think a good thing for the people, based on what I see, secularism is the right thing. I'm going to introduce this idea to the people. It's not something that came from that. I would argue contrary to any philosopher's arguments that suggest that secularism is something that was originated due to a series of causes and effects that prompted the need for secularism. I will argue contrary to that. And in fact, I would argue that this actually goes back to the prime origin, at the time when Adam alayhi salam and Hawa were conflicted by Iblis. This initial point, this initial chapter where you find the protagonist of this epic and the antagonist of this epic are both identified, and it is demonstrated what each one is actually capable of in their very nature. Their very nature, their very fitrah, what determines the placement of this one against the placement of that one, and why that one behaved in the way he did, and why this one was regarded as superior than that one. This is what, inshallah, I want to look at, and we will look at this in more detail over the next 3 episodes. I'm going to break it down. In the next episode, inshallah, we will be looking at Adam alayhi salam and his creation as the Khalifa. What does that mean? What did Allah mean when He said, I'm placing a Khalifa on earth? And then what did the angels mean when they asked, are you going to place someone there who will cause corruption and bloodshed while we glorify you, sanctify you with praise? What does it mean when Allah bestowed upon Adam the names? What does that mean? What was this ability that Adam was able to execute, in contrast to what the angels were unable to do? And how is it that this ability makes him unique from the rest of creation? Then we are going to look at, in the following episode, the counter-ideology presented now. What transpired insofar as Iblis is concerned? What motions did he make? Because it had already been established that there was something in his heart that he did not like of Adam, in the manner in which he was examining and moving around and looking at the body and examining this and pondering over what exactly is this creature. And then when the commandment came to prostrate in respect, he refused while the angels performed that act. Why did he refuse? Why was it established that he was proud and arrogant about it? What exactly is it that led him to that conclusion? What was his argument or his justification? More so than that, what exactly did he do to try and disprove, or rather to justify his own actions of not doing it? What did he do against Adam? What was the first attack? What was he trying to demonstrate there? And what technique did he use? Because that is what now sets the precedence as the prime ideology. What Adam did sets the prime origin of that one category of a thought that is complete in its submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to divine will. And then what Iblis did serves as the prime origin to demonstrate the thought that is in opposition to that divine will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then from that is what we will now be able to see all the ideologies that are surmounting today. Every avenue that is being employed to attack from all directions to establish what they are now calling the New World Order, right? The Novus Ordo Seclorum, which is the new worldly order. Secular is worldly. It's to do with the dunya. It's to remove the divine. What exactly are they hoping to achieve from this secular world order? How exactly are they going to establish a sort of rule wherein they essentially say and claim that we do not need God's help to govern ourselves? What is the basis of this claim? Where does it originate from? Because if you look at now all the other ideologies that are manifest in the world, you want to look at LGBTQ, you want to look at capitalism, you want to look at all the profanities, you want to look at this decadent lifestyle that is being established around the world, a sense of uniformity. You know, everywhere you look around the world, you see, people are generally dressed the same way. It's almost impossible to distinguish one culture from another unless they actually maintain those traditions and cultural ways. But otherwise, if you go to an airport, for example, any airport in the world, you will essentially see people dressed the same way. You know, it's the shirt and pants society. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with dressing that way, or that it's un-Islamic, or it's haram, or whatever. No, it's not. There's nothing wrong with that. But there is a trace of where that has originated from, this sense of uniformity that is being established. You know, if you go to almost now every hotel, you find this sense of uniformity. Everything is the same. You have just the same bed, you have the same furniture, the same chandelier, you've got the same breakfast table and the continental breakfast on it, and you've got the same concierge service, and, you know, the workers and the uniforms that they wear, and they're all the same. You've got the same services provided. You look, almost all the road networks around the world, they're the same. They've got the same traffic light systems. You know, they've got the same dues and tolls and parking fees and all this. It's all the same. You look at the police forces around the world, they're almost all the same. They've got the same mannerism of operation. In fact, if somebody was to even venture further thought into that, they will realize that even the economies of the world in every country are essentially the same. Though the currencies may differ in their values, insofar as the local economies are concerned, proportionally they are the same as every other economy around the world. Really, because the proportion of an income against expenditure account for a common man in the United States is the same proportion as of somebody who is from Canada, even though the dollar values may differ. Though over here you might get a minimum wage that is maybe $10, over there you're getting $16. Or if you go to, you know, any of the European countries, that one's earning in pound, that one's earning in something else, in euro. The income against their expenditure is essentially the same proportion. And the same is applying to any other part of the world. The income proportion against their expenditure is essentially the same. The system that is applied, there might be some differences in the particulars, but the system of governance is essentially the same system of governance in every country. The education might differ in slight semantics. Over here you might call it a class, over there you might call it a year, over there you might call it a grade, you know. But it's essentially the same curriculum. It's essentially the same system, you know. You've got the term and you've got the class term, and you've got the exam, you've got the midterm, you've got the vacation holiday. You know, you finish one grade, you go to the next one, you finish that one, you go to the next one, then you go to university, and then you go to college, and then you do this and you do that. It's essentially the same system. You know, the child grows up and goes through the same modes of operation. They have the same items, the instruments that they will use. It's the same worldwide, wherever you go. It's the same notebook, pen, and everything. The household functions in essentially the same way. You've got the same sofa, dining table, coffee table, television, you know, utensils, fridge, oven, dishwasher, appliances. It's the same. It's all the same. This uniformity is part of this process of secularization. One of the components of secularization is what we call normalization. Because now you've got something new that is arising, and people are actually misunderstanding this term incredibly, that it is actually clouding them from seeing further than what is actually taking place. Because they assume that normalization only has to do with normalizing political ties with the Zionists and Israel. It's not limited to that. That's only because it's there in the mainstream news. But normalization is an ideology that is actually applying to all facets of life, all across the world. What you might assume to be an anomaly in your past or in your way of life is slowly being converted now, because it's an external factor that is coming in. You see, for example, when televisions first started coming up, the ulama said it's haram. When cameras were first introduced, the ulama said it's haram. But then slowly over time now, it's become part of life. Now, nobody thinks about the permissibility or impermissibility, unless it's a matter of, okay, exactly what kind of program are you watching? or what exactly are you using the camera for? Unless it's a matter of that. But insofar as life is concerned, this is like a norm. Whereas at that time, it was an anomaly. It was an abnormality when it was introduced. This process that it has undergone, this is a process of normalization that many people have remained blind to and have not realized how their lives have actually been transformed to what they're now accepting as the norm. You see, you've got now a generation of children growing up who cannot live without a cell phone. Literally, they cannot think about life without a cell phone. It has to be there. It has to be there wherever they go. Even if they leave from this room to go into the next room, the cell phone has to be there. The fact that it has to be there is the norm. And the fact that it is not there is considered an anomaly. It's an abnormality if it's not there. Whereas the previous generation, you could leave the house and go, wherever you wanted to go the entire day without coming into contact with the phone. It doesn't matter if you needed to call home or something or whatever. And then prior generation to that, they didn't even have phones. I mean, I'm not exactly the prior generation, but then going back a few generations, they didn't even have phones. And that was the norm. So that when the telephone started coming in, it became an anomaly. And then that became the norm. And then, now you have cell phones. When they first came in, it was an anomaly. When things like Facebook and Twitter and all these things first started coming up, these were anomalies. Now it's the norm. Every individual has to have an account for some reason, whatever reason that might be, whether it's for business use or for personal or for socialization or for just, plain time wasting. Whatever it might be, it's actually a norm for you to have that account. There are many companies now that will not, the first thing they will ask when they're recruiting for jobs is what your social media accounts are, because they want to look at that and understand more about you. And to tell them that I don't actually have a social media account like LinkedIn or something, that seems a bit strange. It seems odd. Like, what are you hiding? Why are you hiding? Are you a hermit? Anyway, this is all the time we have for today. Inshallah, we will proceed next week and we'll begin with the story of Adam alayhi salam. سبحانك وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم وتب علينا يا مولانا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين بارك الله فيكم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته جزاكم الله خيرا السلام عليكم ورحمة الله